The fear that once lived only in whispers inside the Kremlin is now echoing across the Black Sea. Crimea, the territory Moscow declared untouchable, is facing a moment many Russian planners believed would never arrive. A zero-day scenario, no warning, no margin for error. Just sudden disruption, collapsing systems, and mass uncertainty for millions of civilians caught in the middle of a modern war that no longer follows old rules. For years, Crimea was presented as Russia's unbreakable fortress. Heavily militarized, politically symbolic, and emotionally charged, it was sold to the Russian public as a permanent victory, a line that Ukraine would never cross. But wars evolve, and so do the tools used to fight them. Today, the peninsula stands exposed in ways that would have seemed impossible just a short time ago. Reports emerging from the region describe a growing humanitarian strain. Water shortages are worsening, infrastructure is under pressure, and evacuation discussions are no longer theoretical. Analysts warn that as many as 5 million people could face severe water insecurity if current conditions continue. Whether through damaged supply routes, disrupted canals, or targeted strikes on logistical systems, the basic lifelines that sustain daily life in Crimea are under threat. This is not just a military problem. It is a civilian crisis unfolding in slow motion. Crimea's vulnerability begins with geography. The peninsula depends heavily on external water sources, particularly canals that originate outside its borders. Since 2014, water access has been a strategic weak point, temporarily alleviated by Russian engineering projects and emergency measures. But wartime pressure changes everything. Precision strikes, sabotage, or cyber operations targeting pumping stations, power grids, or distribution networks can trigger cascading failures within hours. A zero-day scenario does not announce itself with sirens. It arrives silently. Systems go offline. Valves stop working. Communication fails. And suddenly, a region that appeared stable is plunged into chaos. For the Kremlin, this represents more than a logistical nightmare. Crimea is a symbol of legitimacy, power, and historical narrative. Losing control over daily life there, even temporarily, risks shattering the image of absolute authority Moscow has worked for years to maintain. That is why the mere discussion of evacuation is so significant. Governments do not evacuate territories they believe are secure. Yet preparations are reportedly underway, quietly, carefully, without public acknowledgement. Evacuation plans are often framed as precautionary, but history shows they usually follow intelligence assessments pointing to imminent risk. Transportation routes are being evaluated, emergency shelters discussed, medical facilities placed on alert. None of this suggests confidence, it suggests fear. For ordinary residents, the reality is far more personal. Water shortages are not abstract. They mean hospitals struggling to operate, sanitation systems breaking down, food production slowing, and families forced to make impossible choices. In a region already under constant surveillance and military presence, panic spreads quickly when basic necessities become uncertain. Ukraine's strategy, according to defense experts, appears increasingly focused on systemic pressure rather than territorial spectacle. Instead of large-scale frontal assaults, the emphasis is on making occupation unsustainable, target supply chains, disrupt logistics, force the opposing side to spend more resources defending civilians than advancing military goals. This approach reflects the changing nature of warfare in the 21st century. Victory is no longer measured only in captured land, but in the ability to control infrastructure, information, and morale. And in this arena, Crimea is far more fragile than its fortifications suggest. For Vladimir Putin, the implications are profound. Crimea was not just annexed, it was mythologized. It became proof of restored Russian greatness, a political cornerstone that justified enormous domestic and international costs. Any sign that Crimea can be threatened undermines years of messaging and exposes the limits of military power. That is why Russian state media remains cautious, downplaying disruptions and framing challenges as temporary, but silence can be as revealing as alarm. When officials avoid specifics, when language shifts from certainty to reassurance, it often signals deeper concern behind closed doors. International observers are watching closely. A mass evacuation from Crimea would send shockwaves far beyond the region. It would mark a turning point in the conflict, demonstrating that no territory is immune to pressure. It would also raise urgent humanitarian questions, as displaced populations would need housing, water, food, and medical care under already strained conditions. The risk of escalation looms large. Any attempt to relieve pressure through increased force could widen the conflict. Yet failing to act decisively risks losing control over the situation entirely. This is the strategic dilemma Moscow now faces. Respond aggressively and risk broader consequences, or absorb the damage and accept vulnerability. Meanwhile, civilians remain trapped between narratives and realities. Many families in Crimea have lived through years of uncertainty, adjusting to shifting authorities and international isolation. Now they face a new kind of threat, one that cannot be solved with slogans or televised speeches. Water, electricity, and safety are not ideological. They are essential. A zero-day crisis thrives on interconnected systems. Power outages disrupt water pumps. Water shortages affect hospitals. Hospitals rely on supply routes that may already be under attack. Each failure amplifies the next, creating a chain reaction that can overwhelm even well-prepared administrations. Military planners understand this. So do humanitarian agencies. That is why the situation in Crimea is being described as one of the most dangerous flashpoints of the war, not because of imminent invasion, but because of the potential for sudden collapse. For Ukraine, applying pressure on Crimea serves multiple objectives. It stretches Russian defenses, diverts resources from other fronts, and challenges the psychological core of Russian strategic confidence. For the Kremlin, defending Crimea at all costs risks draining strength elsewhere. This is what makes Crimea the epicenter of Putin's worst fear. Not the loss of land alone, but the loss of control, the exposure of weakness, and the realization that even the most symbolically charged territories can become liabilities. As global attention shifts, diplomatic channels grow tense, allies debate red lines, analysts argue over intent and capability. But on the ground, none of that matters to the families waiting in line for water, to doctors calculating how long generators can run, or to officials quietly preparing evacuation lists they hope they will never use. History shows that wars are often decided not by dramatic victories, but by moments when systems fail faster than leaders can respond. Crimea may be approaching such a moment. Whether it becomes a temporary crisis or a defining turning point depends on decisions being made right now, behind closed doors, far from public view. The coming days and weeks will reveal whether this zero-day threat remains a warning or becomes reality. What is clear is that the assumption of permanence is gone. Crimea is no longer untouchable, and once that belief is shattered, the entire strategic landscape changes. For Vladimir Putin, This is not just another battlefield challenge. It is a test of the very narrative that has defined his rule. A reminder that power, no matter how loudly declared, ultimately depends on fragile systems that can fail without notice. And in modern war, fear does not come from armies alone. It comes from silence, from dry taps, from empty reservoirs, and from the sudden realization that the ground beneath even the strongest fortress can give way. The zero day has not officially arrived, but the countdown has begun.